we just assumed that this was a Christian-Muslim conflict because that's how it's always portrayed, but it really wasn't. In part because the Arab world was so diverse religiously.
One of the main reasons why the Crusades occur, if not the main reason, is Jerusalem itself, right? And obviously the city is important to Muslims, to Jews, and to Christians. So before we even get to, the sort of 11th century, let's talk about Jerusalem and just why it's so important to all sort of those three religious groups.
Yeah, okay, so I'll start with the Jewish population. Actually, the way I want to frame it is I want to remind everybody that there was a very diverse group of Semites who lived throughout the Levant, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and then into Iraq, and then into Arabia. Arabs are Semites. The Hebrew language is a Semitic language. It's a sister language to Arabic. Phoenician is another Semitic language. Aramaic is it was at the time a widespread, widely spoken Semitic language. Usually the Semitic language is divided into Western and Eastern. Aramaic is an Eastern Semitic language, and the other three are Western. But there's a bunch of other examples. I don't want to go into them because most of them are extinct. Really only Aramaic, Hebrew, and Arabic are left. But sometimes when we think of Palestine, we think of it as having just had a Jewish population. And the reality is there was a bunch of different Semitic groups running around in Palestine at the same time. So the Jewish people ended up with possession of a huge portion of Palestine, and that included the city of Jerusalem. And the city of Jerusalem itself is perfectly set for defensive purposes. It's a group of hills with springs inside it. So if you build a wall around it, you now have a city that has access to water. They put gardens in that city so they could even produce some food. And then if an enemy attacked, the surrounding area doesn't have water. So you would have to run a bucket chain all the way back to the Jordan River to bring fresh water for your soldiers. And as a result, it put the Jewish population into a position where they could have some security and some level of stability. It didn't mean that Jerusalem couldn't be conquered, and it got conquered multiple times. It was a harder city to capture. They built the Temple of Solomon there. The city became a center for religious purposes, for cultural purposes. And then the Neo-Babylonian Empire famously conquers Palestine. They're furious at Jewish resistance to that conquest. So to punish the Jewish population, they destroy the first Temple of Solomon, and then they forcibly remove a portion of the Jewish people from Jerusalem and move them to Babylon. And the Neo-Babylonian Empire then has them in captivity. It's not the same as slavery. I think a lot of people conflate the two. It's just that the Jewish people couldn't leave Babylon. They weren't necessarily slaves. I have no doubt that there were Jewish slaves. They just not the group that was held in captivity. Cyrus the Great, Kurosh, the Persian who created the Hachemenishi Empire, one of his great contributions to humanity is he wrote a Bill of Rights. And in that Bill of Rights, he banned things like slavery and human sacrifice. And he also made it so that everybody had the right to practice their religion. He conquers the Neo-Babylonian Empire and then in the process frees the Jews from captivity, which is why he's mentioned in the Old Testament. The Jewish population, then a bunch of it returns to Jerusalem, not all of it. A group actually end up moving to Esfahan. Some stay. But a group moves back to Jerusalem and they want to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. And so they come up with new plans that include a human-made mesa. And they approach the Persians and they say, we want our temple rebuilt because according to the freedom of religion that the definition that Kurosh had for his freedom of religion, the state had to fund temples, their maintenance, their construction, their repairs. And so Persian gold, Egyptian engineers built the Temple Mount and then built the second Temple of Solomon on top of it. And a few centuries later, the Romans conquer Palestine. The Jewish population resists. It turns into a bunch of stone-throwing rebels who refuse to submit. They didn't call them intifadas, but they should have because it's the same exact thing. And long story short, the Romans punished the Jewish population multiple times. There were multiple rebellions. The last one that took place during the last Roman-Persian War, which went from 602 AD until 628 AD, so it lasted about 26 years. What happened was when the Persians invaded Palestine and took it from the Roman Empire, the Jewish population rose up and actually supported the Persians. And the Persians allowed a Jewish autonomous state, kingdom, to form in Palestine. Ultimately, the Persians were defeated, and in their surrender terms, the Persians insisted that the Romans accept that they wouldn't do vengeance against the Jewish people. About 1.5, 2 years after the surrender treaty was ratified, the Roman Emperor Heraclius actually broke it and then massacred the Jewish population in Palestine in act of vengeance, and then began a process of forced conversions. And so I think one way to think of Jerusalem is not only does it have direct religious importance to the Jewish people, it also has very significant identity value, especially surrounding the idea of resistance and survival. And this was our city, but we lose it, but we get it back. There's kind of a sense of, at some point, the Jewish people will always return back to Jerusalem, even if they lose it again to somebody else, like the Romans or the Neo-Babylonians. So in a nutshell, I think that's the gist of why it's so important to the Jewish people.
Okay, so we sort of started just before the Babylonians, and now we're in 630 AD, and something very important happens during that period, which is the birth of Jesus Christ, right?
Yeah.
So tell us how that sort of impacts Jerusalem, specifically, and the Christian relationship with the city, not just in terms of symbolism, but also in terms of demography and when they actually settle in the city, and how their presence in the city is, what it does to the city and how it impacts it.
Okay, so one of the things, it's important to remember Jesus was Jewish, but one of the things you have to also remember is that Judaism and Christianity it's a serious break. Judaism is a henotheistic religion as opposed to a monotheistic religion. And the difference between the two is, in monotheism, you believe there is one God. Done. There's no conversation past that. In henotheism, you believe there's one God for your people. But then you believe that other peoples could have other gods. And so there might be a multi-deity universe. It's just your people don't have that. Your people have one God. And so what Jesus basically says is that religion, Judaism, needs an update. And the update is that that religion belongs to everybody on earth. It's not just for Jews. And there is only one God for everybody on earth. And so in a way, it's the serious break, which is why it was not easy for the Jewish population to simply convert. So the people who did convert to Judaism actually went out and did missions elsewhere and began converting.
You mean convert to Christianity?
Convert to Christianity.
Yeah.
So think of like St. Paul, St. Peter. And as they're running around, St. Mark, as these guys are running around, they're not converting the Jewish population to Christianity. They're going to Armenia, and they're going to Egypt, and they're going to central Turkey, and they're going to Italy. They're ending up in Spain and even in Switzerland eventually, and they're converting all these people who were mostly pagan over to Christianity. And of course, Jesus' story takes place not entirely in Jerusalem, but largely in Jerusalem, including his ultimate execution. And so for Christianity, because he's executed in Jerusalem and because he spent so much of his time in Jerusalem, the city took on serious importance to the Christian faith. And then you want me to go into why it's important to Islam as well?
Well, I mean, obviously, but I mean, even before we get there, just sort of, because obviously, I mean, we can speak about symbolically why it's important to Islam. But when for example, Heraclius takes over the city, and I'm assuming he's forcibly converting the Jews into Christians. So what is the Christian presence already in the city at that point? Exactly. By the time we get to 630, Palestine was overwhelmingly Christian. The Roman Empire began converting to Christianity in the first century. It was slow. The Roman Empire was resisting.
sometimes violently. In the 2nd century, there's this, it's still going through this process. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire ends up in really big trouble, and it begins to break apart. In fact, the Roman Empire at one point broke up into 3 empires, and there's an emperor named Diocletian or Diocletian, and he puts the empire back together through force, and then he cuts it into 4 pieces, and he creates 2 emperors and then 2 co-emperors, so that the 4 emperors will sort of run the empire. And then famously, the next emperor, Constantine, undoes everything and becomes the only emperor. And then after him, it goes back to 2 emperors. But they stabilized the Roman Empire. And part of doing that was, in the crisis of the 3rd century, there was a large conversion to Christianity. Because people, as their security was falling apart, they found that, making a sacrifice to Jupiter just wasn't very satisfying anymore, whereas the promise of Christianity seemed to fit with people in crisis better. And so there was a lot of conversion. So Emperor Constantine had a problem. And the problem was, what am I going to do with this really large Christian population? I can't ignore it anymore. So what he did was he made it so that Christianity was one of the 2 official religions of the empire. I don't remember the emperor off the top of my head, but there's an emperor about half a century later who makes it so Christianity is the only legal religion, only official religion. And then Emperor Theodosius in 391 puts out an edict declaring that Christianity is the only legal religion in the empire. The earlier one was official. This one is legal. So if you're Jewish or pagan, you are no longer allowed to live in the empire. And this results in a little bit of a catastrophe in Alexandria. The Great Library is burnt, and the Jewish population is massacred. But by that point, by 391, the Roman Empire, from Palestine to Spain, the whole thing is overwhelmingly majority Christian. There were still pockets of Jewish and pagan populations, but not many. So when Emperor Heraclius does this to the Jews in Palestine, he's massacring a small minority, even in Palestine, like not just the empire itself.
Okay, and then the Prophet Muhammad is born in about 570 AD, and how does that change the scene? So,
because Islam sees itself in many ways as, Christianity updated, it's following this path of Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Because of that, a lot of the stories follow over, and all of the prophets follow over, and of course Jesus plays this really important role in Islam. And so the city itself became a focal point as being one of the 3 most religious cities in Islam, obviously with Mecca and Medina. And in Islam, Christians and Jews have access to heaven. So it's a religion that doesn't say this is the only path to salvation. There are other paths to salvation. I think the idea might be expressed as Islam is the best path to salvation, is the one we are most likely to succeed, but that doesn't mean that it rules out other paths. Eventually, Zoroastrianism was accepted as a path to salvation as well. And so when the Muslims conquer Palestine, which is the conquest begins in 634, and then the Battle of Yarmouk is in 636. Jerusalem is captured shortly after the Battle of Yarmouk. When that happens, it becomes really important in the minds of the leadership, Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Khalifa, that there'd be a Jewish presence in Jerusalem. And when they enter the city, when the city surrenders, and Jerusalem was captured peacefully, when the city surrenders, he asks to meet the Jewish leadership in the city. And the Christian leadership says, no, we massacred them. We massacred them just 6 years ago. Like this place was just emptied out. And the Khalifa says, no, this is inappropriate. This is wrong. And he turns to a person who was a Jewish Yemeni who had converted to Islam, and he asks him to go and actually find multiple Jewish families to voluntarily move to Jerusalem so that there can be this Jewish presence there. And so another thing that he does that I think is really important is Archbishop of Jerusalem, his name was Sophronius. Sophronius actually invited the Khalifa to go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and pray with him. And Omar said, no, I believe that if I do that, your church will be seized from you and turned into a mosque, because it's the first place that a Khalifa prayed in Jerusalem, and I respect you and I respect your religion too much to do this. And so let's go find an empty space to pray in. And so I want to pray with you. I just don't want you to lose your church. And of course, the Khalifa was right. The spot that they prayed in eventually became a mosque, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre still belongs to Christianity. And so when the Muslims took Jerusalem, they treated it like a holy city, and they made it very clear to the Jewish and Christian populations that they had a space, they had a place, and that place was a place of honor and respect. What's interesting is under Muslim rule, the city ended up being carved into 4 quarters. There were 2 Christian quarters, 1 Jewish quarter, and 1 Muslim quarter. And so even though the city was holy for all 3 religions, Christians sort of got priority under Muslim rule and did very well under Muslim rule. But Jews did great too. It's just population-wise, the Christians were bigger.
And sort of, so how long did the Muslims rule the city for? And does it sort of, is that spirit of tolerance there for until the Crusaders arrive on the scene? How does the city develop? How does the region change? And sort of like, let's what's that terrain like up until about probably the year about 1050 when the Crusades are about to start occurring?
Okay, so for the 4.5 centuries from the Muslim capture of Jerusalem until the Crusades start, there were moments when tolerance levels dropped a little bit, and then there were moments when it's higher. On average, it was a period of tolerance. Christian and Muslim populations thrived under Muslim rule. You can always find that moment where there was a leader who did something kind of nasty. The thing that pops into my head was there was an early Fatimid leader who tried to close down the churches in Egypt, for example. And then the very next Fatimid leader rescinds that order and goes, no, this is crazy. We're not doing that. So, you get the kind of leadership that you can get in every society where it ebbs and flows. But for the most part, Jews and Christians did very well. The Crusaders, of course, will rule the city for a few decades. On the other side of it, that tolerance actually returned. And so if you look at the period from 636 until 1948, is that the year we want to use, or do we want to use 1919 when the British take it? Let's go with 1919 with the end.
I think 1919 makes more sense. Yeah, but I mean, look, it's up to you. Yeah.
It was a city of tolerance, with the exception of the Crusader period. It was a place where people peacefully coexisted and thrived, and so it's really hard to find fault with what was going on during Muslim rule in that city. And then again, I'm sure you can find like this every once in a while. There's a bad leader who did something that you point to and go, oh, maybe that wasn't great, but for the most part, it was.
Okay, so you're saying that the city was kind of peaceful, and I'm sure a lot of that by extension means that the region was more or less tolerant. I mean, my own understanding of the history of these various Islamic sort of empires and sub-empires that emerge is that it's mainly sort of a lot of court battles, right? A lot of empires, families taking out families so that they can rule smaller or bigger chunks of land. I mean, just your own impressions on that, but sort of what gives rise to this need for a crusade then? And I mean, I'm guessing there's already sort of some like a legacy sort of beef that's occurring, right, between Christians and Muslims that starts not just over the Crusades, but maybe a bit bigger. And why does why does that sort of legacy come into existence if the Muslim empire is so tolerant? And then why do the Crusades? Why are they sort of announced by the popes?
Yeah. So when the Muslim empire, actually, let me rephrase that because I don't like that term. When the Arab empire is created, which it starts in 633 when Khalid ibn al-Walid takes his army into what is today Kuwait. It was part of the Persian Empire at the time. From that moment, the Muslim, by the time you get to about 711, so 633 to 711 is at 78 years, the Arab Empire stretched from Spain to Pakistan, and it actually went into Central Asia. So it became the largest empire to that date. There have been empires much bigger after that, but nothing was bigger before that. And it was built in a very fast period of time, right? 78 years is nothing. At that moment, it was majority Christian, so probably around 60 or so percent Christian. But also, the majority of the world's Christians lived in that empire. So there was sort of like a moment of, here's this empire that's about 5% Muslim. Maybe it was, 2% Jewish. It was probably about 10% Buddhist. It was probably about 15% Zoroastrian. And it's 60% Christian. And the majority of the world's Christians live in it. And I think it kind of broke the minds of the Roman Empire and Western Europe, because they thought of themselves as the bastions of Christianity fighting against Muslim expansion.
Okay, so this demographic is probably like around about the year 730, 740, just to sort of have a timeline.
Yes. Yeah. 711 is the year I picked, but it'll be the same in 730.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So, Western Europe was Catholic. Eastern Europe was Orthodox. They hadn't officially split until, 1054 with the Great Schism. But they've already separated politically, right? Because you have the Pope in Rome who doesn't get along with the Patriarch of Constantinople. They're constantly bickering back and forth, which is why there'll be the Great Schism in the 11th century. But they saw themselves as the bulwarks against Muslim expansion. And so they saw Islam as this horrible religion that had to be stopped at all costs, and they were intolerant. Those Christian states, whether it was the thing that Charlemagne rules that becomes France, or the Roman Empire, they did not have a concept of tolerance. Non-Christians were not accepted. It was not okay to be Jewish or Muslim in those states. And they even had expressed intentions of pushing out the Muslim populations. So once the kingdoms in the north of what is today Spain are formed, the Christian kingdoms, their express goal is to conquer all of the Iberian Peninsula and drive the Muslims out and expel or convert the Jewish and Muslim populations. So right from the start, we have this dichotomy of there's this intolerant group of people fighting a tolerant group of people. And the reality then doesn't matter, right? When you're intolerant, you always see the other side as bad, no matter how good they are, because you just don't like them. That's the nature of the relationship. And so that's exactly what was happening. It didn't matter that you could go to Jerusalem if you were a Christian. In their minds, Christians should own Jerusalem. And what happened was the Roman Empire suffered a series of really nasty defeats. Alexios Komnenos, the Roman emperor, actually went to the Pope in Rome in 1095 and said, we're getting really badly beaten. We've lost Antioch. We're being pushed in central Anatolia. Things are grim, and I need help. And the Pope in Rome said, we have... I don't get along with the Patriarch of Constantinople, but obviously we need to be working together. You got to remember that the Roman Empire has lost the city of Rome. The Charlemagne had actually broken the city of Rome out. So the Pope in Rome is the Duke of the city of Rome, and he is a ruler in and of himself. And he says, "Okay, I'll see what I can do." And so in 1095, the Pope calls for the Crusade. And the idea is that these Western Europeans will then march to Jerusalem, conquer it, and give it to the Roman Empire. The Pope calls for the Crusades in 1095. Nothing happens. The next year, a guy named Peter the Hermit gets up in front of everybody and says, we should really do what the Pope asked for last year, and then the Crusades actually start.
Okay, so is Peter is he close to the Pope, like physically? Is he somewhere else?
Just some random guy in France.
Okay, so I mean, he may have met the Pope, but it's not like he's in the same city or the capital or where the Vatican is. None of that sort. And so, before we actually start with the Crusades moving, give me a sense of how the demography has changed from 730 to 1095 now, because now I'm assuming it's majority Muslim. Over the years, people have converted. There's been, a lot of infighting in various sort of Muslim and Arab and Persian and Turkish empires by now, which make up the Arab world. So what's the formerly united Arab empire, which swept from Spain to Pakistan? What's that like now? And then we can start with the Crusades.
Yeah, okay. So the Arab Empire doesn't last very long. It was built really quickly and it implodes really quickly. The first piece comes off. It's Spain in, I think it was either 734 or 736. 754 or 756. Spain breaks away from the Arab Empire, and it just, little by little, it loses Morocco a few years after that. By 890, what is today northern Syria, southern Turkey, and northern Iraq breaks away. And then in 934, the Buyids break away. The Buyids were Persians who had actually been very heavily involved in the Abbasid court, and they just sort of carved out a chunk of Persia from the Arab Empire and began ruling it on their own, and then slowly kept expanding until the Buyids literally captured Baghdad and captured the Khalifa, So by that point, I think sometime around, I don't know exactly the year you need to call the Arab Empire dead, but by 934, as the Buyids are going off and doing their own thing, I think it's pretty much dead. The Fatimids break away. So one of the things that's interesting is because there wasn't any meaningful forced conversion going on in the Arab Empire, it was only slowly and organically converting to Islam. There wasn't, this mad rush to the religion. One of the things driving it, strangely enough, was the tax code. If you were not a Muslim, you paid a specific amount of gold. An ounce or maybe 2 ounces of gold per year. It fluctuated a little bit. It was something like that. If you were a Muslim, you paid a percentage, and that had to go to taking care of the poor and the infirm and the sick. So, in other words, the Arab Empire was actually a social welfare state, and Muslims paid into the social welfare state, and then non-Muslims, with that chunk of gold they had to give, that money could be spent on anything. So that's how the state operated. So there was also an incentive on the part of the state to not encourage too much conversion, because it would mean that their taxes that they would be able to spend on an army or building roads would become limited. And then if you were rich, you wanted to pay the lump sum. If you were poor, you wanted to pay the percentage. So the majority of people converting were actually poor. And so Islam sort of organically grew out of the poor population in the empire. And, the rich Zoroastrians, rich Christians, and rich Jews sort of hesitated in converting. So that by the time we get to, the Crusades, Egypt is still majority Christian. It was probably 2/3 Christian at this point. Egypt didn't probably become majority Muslim until right around the year 1300. It may have been a little bit earlier, but right around there. Palestine had a massive Christian population. It was probably 40% Christian by the time the Crusades started. Syria had a very significant Christian population. It was probably 25%, somewhere in that area. So it wasn't homogenous by any means. And I think we just assumed that this was a Christian-Muslim conflict because that's how it's always portrayed. But it really wasn't, in part because the Arab world was so diverse religiously and ethnically, right? There was also, by the time we got to about the year 900, Egypt had become majority Arabic speaking, but it was still speaking the pharaonic language. It was still around. It's Coptic. And so, maybe as much as 40% of the Egyptian population was speaking Coptic instead of speaking Arabic. And there was still a huge Aramaean population in Palestine and Syria. They were speaking Aramaic. There was a huge Armenian population. There was a huge Kurdish population. And then, of course, the mercenaries that were being hired to operate the armies were Turks. So there was a huge Turkish population. So it was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. And then, of course, there was a significant Jewish population. Jews were, relatively still a small population, but as a percentage of the population, there were more Jews in the Middle East than there were in Europe, and they were an integral part of the society as well. By contrast, in Europe, right, by the time we get to the Crusades, the West has become Catholic, the East is Orthodox, and there is ethnic diversity for sure, but there's no religious diversity. It's you're either on one side or the other, and there isn't any wiggle room. There's no tolerance for the non-Catholics or the non-Orthodox.